Hey there. Tonight we step into a moment where history was still being written, when the sea in Venice was alive with secrets, its waves whispering to the stone walls of the city. In the flickering light of oil lamps, merchants counted coins, lovers exchanged hurried glances, and sailors dreamed of faraway worlds. But in a modest home tucked between the narrow canals, a boy named Marco stared out into the dark horizon, not with fear, but with a hunger that would one day take him beyond the edges of every known map. His name would be etched into history, not as a mere traveler, but as the man who unlocked the East for the West. This is the story of Marco Polo, the boy who followed the winds and found an empire. The air of Venice in the year 1254 was a perfume of contradictions, a mingling of brine and silk, salt water and incense, the musk of damp wood from centuries-old piers, and the sharp spice of pepper unloaded fresh from distant shores. Gondolas rocked gently in the early morning tide, their hulls creaking like old men telling secrets. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolled, slow, deliberate, each note rolling over the water as if reluctant to leave. The rising sun spilled molten gold across the lagoon, setting the domes of San Marco aflame in brilliance, a sight that seemed almost designed to make merchants and monarchs alike believe Venice had been kissed by the divine. Yet beneath this beauty, the city was a battlefield, not of swords and shields, but of trade routes and political cunning. Venice thrived not by accident, but by design, a shrewd republic whose lifeblood was commerce and whose soul was ambition. The Doge's palace stood like a sentinel over the Grand Canal, its Gothic arches whispering of treaties signed in candlelit chambers, of fortunes made and lost with a single shipment's arrival or disappearance. In the narrow alleys, life pulsed in 1,000 tiny dramas. A baker's boy, barefoot and dusty with flour, darted past a perfumer arranging jars of rose oil brought from Damascus. A pair of weather-beaten sailors argued in Greek over a misplaced shipment, their voices roughened by years of sea wind. Above it all, fluttering banners bore the proud golden lion of St. Mark, the emblem of a city whose reach extended far beyond the horizon. Somewhere in this labyrinth of canals and cobblestones, in a modest stone house not far from the Rialto, a child named Marco Polo opened his eyes to a world he did not yet understand, a world that was already shaping him. He was born into wealth, but not into the idle comfort of nobility. His family were merchants, the kind whose fortunes were made not in banquet halls, but in the perilous crossing of mountains, deserts, and seas. His father, Niccolo Polo, was already far from home when Marco entered the world, chasing opportunity along the shifting currents of Mediterranean trade. His mother, alone but dignified, managed the household with a quiet strength, her gaze often lingering eastward over the water as if willing her husband to return. Venice could be a cradle and a crucible both. For Marco, it was a place of constant contrast. Grand palaces reflected in the same waters that carried the stink of fish markets, the solemn Latin hymns of the church rising above the coarse laughter of dockside taverns. By the time he was old enough to walk the narrow quays, Marco had learned to read the city as if it were a living map. The rustle of silk meant a ship from the Levant. The deep bellow of a horn signaled a vessel heavy with grain from Sicily. The sudden clang of the shipyard's hammers spoke of galleys being built for voyages he could only dream about. But dreams were dangerous in Venice. Here, every ambition came at a cost. The Republic was locked in a quiet but deadly competition with Genoa, its rival across the sea. Merchant fleets were as much weapons as they were lifelines, and alliances could shift faster than the tides. In such a place, even a boy could sense the invisible currents of power swirling around him. Marco, though young, had already inherited something from his father. Not just the Polo name, but the restless fire that made a man stare at a map and wonder what lay beyond its edges. In the evenings, he would sit by the hearth as his mother recited stories told by sailors, of cities where the streets were paved with porcelain tiles, of markets where gems the size of pigeons' eggs were traded for bolts of cloth, of rulers so powerful they could order the seasons themselves. He listened and he remembered. The year Marco Polo turned 6, Venice was a city caught between triumph and unease. Its merchant fleets returned heavy with spices, silks, and jewels, but every ship that glided into the Grand Canal carried rumors alongside its cargo. Whispers of unrest in the east. Trade agreements threatened by sudden wars. Even the sea, once the Republic's most trusted ally, had begun to feel unpredictable, storms swelling without warning, tides gnawing at the very foundations of palaces. Niccolo Polo, Marco's father, had been gone for years. The boy's earliest memories of him were fleeting, a broad-shouldered man with eyes that seemed fixed on some distant horizon, a scent of salt and leather clinging to his clothes, a voice that spoke in measured tones as if each word had been bargained for. By the time Marco was old enough to understand the meaning of absence, Niccolo's place at the family table was already a ghost. Marco's mother, Orsetta, rarely spoke of her husband's journeys. She kept her grief neatly folded, like linens in a cedar chest, hidden from sight but unmistakable in its scent. She managed the household with a quiet grace, her days filled with the careful balancing of accounts, correspondence with trading partners, and the endless negotiations required to maintain status in a city where fortunes shifted with the tide. To Marco, she was the anchor of his small world, the one constant in a city built on water. And then, one spring morning, she was gone. It happened quickly, an illness that began as a fever and ended as a silence that would echo in Marco's life for decades. The house on the narrow calle became unnaturally still. The servants spoke in hushed tones. The neighbors, accustomed to the sight of Orsetta in her fine yet modest gowns, shook their heads and muttered that the sea had claimed another in its own way. Marco was sent to live with an aunt and uncle, his cousins becoming his new companions. They were kind, but their home was not his own. At night, he would lie awake listening to the soft lap of water against the foundations, wondering if the sound carried his father's ship closer or farther away. Venice itself seemed to take on a new character in those years. Without his mother's presence, the city's grandeur felt colder, its beauty edged with indifference. The shimmering reflection of moonlight on the canals became, in the boy's mind, a kind of mocking laughter, as if the city knew it could take as easily as it gave. Yet, in this loneliness, something began to take root in Marco, a deep, gnawing curiosity about the world beyond the lagoon. If Venice could be so full of both wonder and loss, what else lay in the lands his father chased? He found fragments of answers in the marketplace. There, he would linger near the stalls of spice merchants, inhaling the resinous perfume of frankincense and myrrh, the biting sharpness of cinnamon. He would listen to sailors speak of Constantinople's golden gates, of deserts so vast the sun itself seemed trapped above them, of rivers that ran like silver threads through emerald forests. Sometimes, a traveler would notice the boy's quiet attention and toss him a coin from a far-off place, a bit of Mongol copper, or a Byzantine numisma, and Marco would turn it over in his palm, staring at the foreign script as though it were a message meant for him alone. But even as he fed on these scraps of the wider world, the political winds in Venice were shifting. The rivalry with Genoa was no longer confined to whispered threats in merchant halls. Skirmishes at sea had begun to flare, each side seizing ships and cargo with growing boldness. The city's leaders debated strategies behind the guarded walls of the Doge's palace, their decisions shaping the fate of every merchant, every sailor, and every family with fortunes tied to the trade routes. Marco's uncles, Maffeo and Niccolo, still somewhere far to the east, were part of those trade currents. Their absence was more than a personal loss, it was a gamble for the family's future. Without them, the Polo name in Venice was a vessel at anchor, waiting for the wind to return. And so Marco grew, a boy without parents, but not without purpose. He carried their absence like a map with missing pieces, determined one day to fill in the blanks himself. He did not yet know that his journey would take him farther than either of them had ever dreamed, into lands where the very language of the sea would give way to the silence of deserts, the echo of mountains, and the thunder of hooves on endless grass. But for now, his world was still Venice, a city that taught him beauty could be dangerous, that loss could sharpen the mind, and that somewhere, far beyond the mist that sometimes shrouded the lagoon, destiny waited. Act 1, Part 3, The Boy Who Listened to the World. In the years after his mother's death, Marco's days settled into a rhythm, part disciplined, part restless. His uncle, Andrea, insisted that the boy receive the education befitting a young Venetian of mercantile blood. Each morning, Marco would walk through the narrow, winding calle toward the small private school run by a learned notary, Master Pietro. The air always smelled of brine and baked bread, fishermen's voices mixed with the calls of women selling figs and olives. Above it all, the bells of San Marco rang with a tone that was both command and invitation. Master Pietro's classroom was a sparse, drafty chamber above a cooper's shop. Here, Marco learned Latin, the formal tongue of the church and law, and vulgar, the Venetian dialect that flowed like the canals, smooth when it needed to be, sharp when it must cut. He studied arithmetic, for no merchant could survive without it, and the art of double-entry bookkeeping, a skill so new that it still puzzled many in the city. Geography lessons were not dry recitations of place names. Master Pietro would unroll maps like secret treasures, their inked coastlines curling with the promise of mystery. Some of these maps were incomplete, their interiors blank save for small illustrations, a lion in Africa, a dragon in the east, and in those blanks Marco saw not nothingness, but possibility. Yet as much as he absorbed from these lessons, Marco's true education came after the classroom closed. Freed from the polite silence of study, he would slip away toward the docks, where the heart of Venice beat loudest. The quays were a constant performance, sailors shouting over the creak of rigging, the slap of water against hulls, the clatter of cargo being unloaded, sacks of pepper spilling a dark, sharp scent into the air, bolts of silk catching the sunlight like liquid color. Here, he could hear stories unfiltered by the caution of tutors. The sailors' tongues were as varied as the goods they carried. Greek, Arabic, Persian, and dialects Marco could not place poured into the humid air, each word carrying the flavor of a distant shore. He learned to catch fragments, to piece together meaning from tone and gesture. A Turk might describe the heat of Anatolia's plains, his voice lowering when he spoke of bandits. A Byzantine merchant would boast of Constantinople's markets, where even the air seemed scented with gold. A Genoese captain, though grudgingly, might admit to the vast riches of the Mongol lands. One afternoon, leaning against a pile of coiled ropes, Marco overheard a tale that lodged itself deep in his imagination. A grizzled merchant from Trebizond spoke of a city called Cambaluc, the seat of the great Khan himself. The man's eyes gleamed as he described palaces of white stone, walls so vast that 1,000 soldiers could march across them, markets overflowing with jade, pearls, and spices unknown in the West. But what struck Marco most was not the wealth. It was the idea of a ruler whose empire stretched farther than any map could hold, where the sun rose on one coast and set on another, all under a single banner. Beyond the deserts, the merchant said, there are rivers the size of seas, forests that stretch for weeks, and men who ride from horizon to horizon without stopping. The world, boy, is bigger than you think. Marco said nothing, but the words burned into him like a seal into wax. At home, he began to ask his aunt cautious questions about his father's journeys. She would sigh and shake her head, muttering that such matters were best left to the men who risked their lives for profit. But sometimes, in the soft haze before sleep, Marco imagined Niccolo riding across a wind-scoured plain, his eyes fixed on a far-off city. He imagined letters sent from those places, carried by riders and ships, crossing deserts and seas to find their way to him, though none ever did. Venice, meanwhile, was shifting again. The wealth pouring in from trade only deepened the city's rivalries, both abroad and within. Powerful families vied for influence with the precision of chess players, their moves often invisible until a piece, or a man, was taken off the board. From the high windows of his uncle's house, Marco could see the spires of churches rising above the rooftops, each a monument to both piety and power. He was beginning to understand that in Venice, the two were often the same. And yet, beneath all this, the lagoon remained unchanged. Its waters reflected the sky in every mood, from the pearl gray of dawn to the fire of sunset. For Marco, it became a mirror of possibility, a reminder that beyond those narrow streets and guarded palaces lay a world whose stories had only just begun to reach him. By Marco's 12th year, the air in Venice seemed sharper, as if even the wind carried the tension of an unseen contest. Conversations in the markets grew hushed when strangers passed. Messengers slipped through narrow alleys with letters sealed in wax bearing family crests. The rivalry between Venice and Genoa, always present, like a slow current beneath the surface, had swelled into a tide that threatened to drag both republics into open war. Venice's position as the Queen of the Adriatic had never been more enviable or more contested. Her fleets controlled much of the Mediterranean trade. Her merchants held outposts from the Dalmatian coast to the islands of the Aegean. But Genoa, her old adversary, was just as ambitious, its ships swift, its traders shrewd, its alliances far-reaching. To the boy Marco, these tensions were like the murmur of a storm on the horizon, distant but impossible to ignore. His uncle Andrea would sometimes return home flushed from meetings with other merchants, speaking in quick bursts about embargoes, tariffs, and ships seized in disputed waters. The names of distant ports, Caffa, Tana, Acre, fell into the conversation like coded signals. Marco listened, storing them away like pieces of a puzzle. He began to realize that commerce was not only about goods but about power. Each sack of spice, each bolt of silk, was a move in a game that could determine the fate of cities. Yet even as Venice's gaze turned toward its rival, there were other whispers, stranger, older, more alluring. Sailors spoke of the East not just as a source of luxury, but as a realm ruled by a figure whose power dwarfed even that of Venice's Doge or Genoa's council. They spoke of the Great Khan, lord of the Mongol Empire, whose dominion stretched from the cold steppes of Russia to the warm shores of the South China Sea. It was said that his armies moved like shadows over the land, appearing and vanishing without warning. His messengers could cross 1,000 miles faster than any ship, galloping from relay station to relay station where fresh horses awaited them. His cities, they claimed, were not just large. They were vast, planned with a precision unknown in the West, their markets overflowing with goods no Venetian had ever seen. One evening, in a tavern near the Rialto, Marco found himself listening to a half-drunk Genoese pilot whose ship had once sailed to the Black Sea. The man, bitter about his fortunes, nevertheless could not hide the awe in his voice as he spoke of meeting men from the East, Tatars he called them, who carried furs of strange beasts, stones that gleamed like captured moonlight, and tales of cities where the roofs themselves were tiled with gold. "They serve a lord who fears nothing," the pilot said, slamming his cup onto the table. "Not the Pope, not the Sultan, not even death. His word is law from the forests of Rus to the jungles of Ind. If he wanted, he could send an army across the world and take Venice in a fortnight." The words struck Marco with equal parts dread and fascination. Was it possible that beyond the maps and the seas lay a ruler so absolute, so unreachable? And what kind of land could breed such a man? At night, lying in his small bed beneath a window that looked toward the dark waters of the lagoon, Marco would picture a road that began at Venice's edge and wound eastward without end. He imagined riding it, through the ports of the Levant, across the deserts of Persia, over mountains that scraped the sky, until he reached the gates of the Great Khan's city. There, perhaps, he would stand before the ruler himself, a man who commanded half the known world, and see with his own eyes what so many had only whispered. But for now, he was still a boy bound to an island city, his life measured in tides and seasons. The East was a horizon he could not yet touch, and yet it was drawing nearer, carried on the tide of events that were already beginning to shift in ways he could not imagine. It was early spring when Venice began to change. The winter mists that clung to the lagoon loosened their grip, and the smell of thawed earth drifted in from the mainland. Gondoliers, who had spent months wrapped in cloaks, now rode bare-armed beneath a sun that hinted at warmth to come. In the market, merchants laid out fabrics with brighter colors, and fishmongers called louder, as if the turning of the season demanded a new energy. Marco, now 15, had grown taller, his frame still slim but his stride more confident. He moved through the city with a boy's restlessness, but a young man's eyes, sharp, searching, hungry for stories. His days were divided between helping in the family warehouse, studying letters and numbers, and lingering by the docks where the real news of the world arrived on the tide. It was there, among the labyrinth of masts and rigging, that the first rumor reached him. 2 Venetian merchants, it was said, had returned from lands so far east that even the most seasoned sailors struggled to name them. They had crossed deserts and mountains, passed through the courts of kings, and, if the whispers were true, stood before the great Khan himself. Their journey had taken years, and they carried not only goods but letters from the Khan addressed to the Pope of Rome. The names of these merchants spread quickly, passed from lips to ears like an incantation: Marco Polo and Marco Polo. Marco felt the words strike him like a physical blow. Niccolò, his father's name. But it could not be, could it? His father was a ghost in his life, a figure of half-remembered stories, a man whose absence had been as constant as the tides. Marco had imagined him 100 ways, as a stern, distant trader, as a fearless traveler striding into the unknown, as a stranger who might not even recognize his own son. Now, the possibility that this man might be in Venice, breathing the same salt air, walking the same streets, made Marco's chest tighten. He said nothing to his uncle Andrea, but his mind whirled with questions. The day the news was confirmed, Marco could barely focus on his work. Andrea, for all his usual composure, seemed distracted as well. In the evening, he told Marco to put on his best tunic. They were going to meet someone. The walk to the appointed house felt endless. The streets were alive with the glow of oil lamps, their light pooling in gold and shadow along the canals. Every footstep echoed in Marco's ears. As they turned a final corner, Andrea stopped and rested a hand on his nephew's shoulder. "Marco," he said quietly, "you are about to meet your father." The door opened before Marco could respond. And there he was. Marco Polo was not as Marco had imagined. He was more. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined at the eyes from years of squinting across open horizons. His beard was streaked with gray, and his clothes, though Venetian in cut, bore the wear of countless miles. He stood with the poise of a man who had been both guest and negotiator in the courts of kings. But when his gaze fell on Marco, the formality dropped. A flicker of something, recognition, pride, perhaps even regret, crossed his face. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The years between them were heavy, but in that silence, Marco felt a bridge forming. Maffeo, taller and broader than his brother, stepped forward with a smile. "So this is the boy," he said, his voice warm. "The stories don't do him justice." That night, in a room lit by the amber glow of lanterns, Niccolò and Maffeo spoke of their journey. They told of riding for weeks across barren plains where the wind cut like a blade, of crossing rivers so wide it took a day to find a place to ford them, of cities filled with markets where you could buy anything from a ruby the size of a dove's egg to spices that could make a simple broth taste like a king's feast. And then they spoke of him, the great Khan. "He is unlike any ruler in the West," Niccolò said, his voice low. "His empire is the world itself. And yet he is curious about ours. He asked us to bring learned men from Rome, to teach his people of Christendom, of our science, of our laws. He wishes to see if there is truth in the ways of the West." Marco listened, eyes wide, drinking in every word. In that moment, the distant road he had imagined for so many nights became something tangible. The East was no longer a dream. It was an invitation. Long after the candles burned low, Marco lay awake, the voices of his father and uncle echoing in his head. He knew, with a certainty that made his heart race, that his life in Venice was ending before it had truly begun. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the road to the Great Khan was waiting. The day of departure dawned under a sky of burnished gold, the kind that makes the waters of Venice shimmer like molten glass. From his small window, Marco could see the lagoon alive with movement, sails unfurling like great white wings, oars dipping in rhythm, gulls wheeling overhead and crying in the salty air. The smell of tar, brine, and wet rope drifted up from the canals, mingled with the faint scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. It was a scent that Marco had known his whole life, and suddenly, he realized it might be years before he smelled it again. Down at the docks, the Polo brothers' ship waited, a sturdy merchant vessel with a high prow and weathered timbers darkened by countless voyages. Its hull was packed with supplies: barrels of salted meat, sacks of grain, bundles of Venetian cloth, and chests locked tight, containing gifts for kings and khans they had yet to meet. The deck bustled with sailors tightening rigging, shouting orders, and checking the anchor chains. The energy was electric, part anticipation, part tension. Marco's heart thudded in his chest as he walked alongside Niccolò and Maffio, their boots clattering against the wooden planks. Andrea Polo was there too, standing apart from the crowd, his arms folded, trying and failing to keep the pride from his eyes. Marco embraced him quickly, the way men do when words are too heavy to say aloud. "Write to us when you can," Andrea murmured. Marco managed a small smile. "If the world lets me." The gangplank groaned under their weight as they boarded. From the deck, Marco turned to look at Venice one last time. The domes of San Marco glowed in the morning light. The bell towers rose like sentinels, and the canals shimmered like silver threads weaving the city together. He thought of the nights spent listening to dockside tales, of the markets where merchants haggled in half a dozen tongues, of the narrow alleys where he had dreamed of adventures beyond the horizon. Every stone, every shadow seemed sharper now that he was leaving. The ship's captain, a grizzled man named Benedetto, barked an order. Sailors hauled at ropes, the great canvas sails filled with wind, and the ship eased away from the dock with a slow, majestic glide. The city began to recede, the calls of vendors fading into the rhythmic slap of water against the hull. Marco stood at the rail, the wind pulling at his hair, the salt spray cool against his face. The sense of movement was intoxicating. Each roll of the deck beneath his feet was a reminder that they were no longer bound to the fixed stones of Venice. Ahead lay a vast and unknowable world. Niccolò placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "The road will change you," he said. "You must be ready to see things no Venetian has seen before." Maffio chuckled. "And ready to eat things no Venetian has eaten before." Marco grinned, but inside, his chest was tight. He thought of his mother, whose grave he had visited one last time before leaving. He thought of the empty years without his father, now filled with the sudden, overwhelming reality of his presence. And he thought of the Great Khan, a figure he knew only from his father's stories, but who now seemed to stand just beyond the horizon, waiting. The ship passed beyond the shelter of the lagoon into the open Adriatic. The waves grew higher, the wind stronger. The city was now just a smear of color against the sky. Marco kept his eyes forward. Venice was behind him. The world was ahead. Days at sea blurred into a rhythm. The groan of timbers, the creak of ropes, the slap of waves against the hull. At first, Marco would wake each morning to the sight of nothing but sky and water, the horizon a thin line that seemed to mock his hunger for change. But slowly, the voyage began to unfold like a scroll. The Adriatic widened, its green-blue waters giving way to the deeper blues of the Ionian Sea, and with every passing day, the air grew warmer, heavier with scents foreign to Venetian shores. Their first major port was the island of Corfu, a rocky jewel under Byzantine rule, its harbor guarded by crumbling stone towers that had stood since Roman times. From the deck, Marco watched fishermen mend their nets, their bronzed arms glistening in the sun, while Greek merchants in flowing robes argued over crates of olives, amphorae of wine, and bundles of herbs. The language here was strange to Marco's ear, sharp consonants, rolling vowels, but in the marketplace, trade spoke its own universal tongue. Mafio led him through narrow streets where the air shimmered with heat, past shrines where oil lamps flickered before painted icons. "Remember this," his uncle said, gesturing at the mingling of cultures. "Every port is a crossroads. You'll see more of the world here than some men do in a lifetime." From Corfu, they sailed south and east, skirting the coastlines of the Peloponnese, their nights lit by constellations Marco had never noticed in the Venetian sky. The next great port, and one that seemed to hum with the pulse of centuries, was Acre, the last Crusader stronghold in the Levant. Here, the smell hit him first, a thick, intoxicating blend of spices, cinnamon, saffron, cloves, carried on the dry, hot wind from the markets. Acre's harbor was a forest of masts, its docks lined with ships from every corner of the known world. Here, Templar knights in chainmail passed Arab traders in flowing white robes, while Armenian merchants bargained with men from Genoa, Pisa, and Marseille. The streets rang with the clang of blacksmiths, the cries of water sellers, the calls to prayer from minarets rising above the rooftops. Marco drank it all in, feeling both overwhelmed and strangely at home in this chaos of tongues and faces. In a spice shop near the harbor, he touched cinnamon sticks as long as his forearm, inhaled the pungent perfume of cardamom, and tasted a grain of salt that sparkled like crushed pearls. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a beard like a snowdrift, leaned close and said in halting Italian, "This only the beginning. Farther east, more wonders." That night, back aboard the ship, Marco could not sleep. The sense of Acre clung to his clothes and hair, and his mind buzzed with images, silk banners rippling in the market wind, gold coins changing hands, strange fruits bursting with sweet, unfamiliar flavors. He thought of the Great Khan again, and realized that this port, dazzling as it was only the first small threshold on the road to that distant court. The next morning, their ship turned its prow towards Cyprus, and beyond it, the Levantine coast. Each port ahead was another brushstroke in a vast painting he could barely see yet, but already the colors were brighter than anything Venice had ever shown him. The Levantine coastline shimmered under the weight of a burning sun when the Polo brothers finally stepped off their ship onto the docks of Ayas, a bustling Armenian port city. The harbor here was smaller than Acres, but no less alive. Its wooden piers groaned under the weight of goods from 3 continents. There were bales of Persian carpets, stacks of copper ingots, and caged birds whose feathers glowed with impossible colors. The air was thicker here, tinged with the scent of sun-baked stone, camel sweat, and sweet resin burned in roadside braziers. Marco's boots crunched over sand and grit as they moved inland, each step pulling him farther from the salt-kissed world of Venice's canals. On the edge of the market square, he saw them for the first time, the caravans. They were not mere lines of beasts, but slow-moving fortresses, dozens of camels draped in bright woven blankets, their long necks swaying as they plodded forward, each carrying loads that bulged like treasure chests. At their head walked men with weathered faces and eyes narrowed against the sun, their robes faded by endless miles of dust. Mafio leaned toward Marco. These are the lifelines of the East. Without them, the silk, the spices, the stories, they would never reach us. The brothers had arranged for a place within one such caravan bound for the interior. As they prepared, Marco wandered to the outskirts of the market where desert began to swallow the edges of the city. The transition was almost violent. One moment, the cool shade of narrow alleys, the next, the open vastness of baked earth and a horizon that trembled with heat. The sky seemed larger here, a brutal dome of blue that left no shelter. Their journey began with the groan of leather straps, the jingle of harness bells, and the steady pad of camel feet on hard earth. The sounds merged into a hypnotic rhythm, as if the caravan itself were breathing. Marco rode beside his father for the first few miles, trying to memorize every detail, the way the wind carried the dry taste of dust into his mouth, the way the sun turned the landscape into shifting gold and ochre, the way the merchants spoke to each other in a mixture of Armenian, Arabic, and a few scattered Italian words. By night, the desert changed its face entirely. The heat fled, replaced by a cold so sharp it cut through Marco's cloak. Above, the stars burned brighter than any lamp in Venice, so numerous they seemed to spill across the heavens. Around the campfires, traders told low stories of lands even farther east, of rivers so wide they swallowed ships, of mountains that scraped the sky, of a ruler whose power could be felt for 1,000 leagues. Marco listened, his eyes reflecting the firelight, and felt the road stretching out before him like one of the constellations above, vast, unending, and filled with shapes he did not yet understand. The caravan moved deeper into the heart of the Levant, where the horizon became an unbroken curve of gold and heat. The early days had been almost gentle, mornings cool, afternoons dry but bearable. Now, the sun rose with a vengeance, spilling molten light that turned the sand into mirrors. The air itself shimmered, twisting shapes in the distance so that even the most solid rocks seemed to waver and vanish. Marco had never known such silence. At sea, there was always the crash of waves, the call of gulls. In Venice, the hum of life never faded. But here, between the low pad of camel feet, there was nothing. No bird call, no rustle of leaves, only the faint whistle of wind across endless dunes. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the chest, demanding attention. One afternoon, while the sun hung high like a suspended forge, the air began to change. Marco noticed it first in the taste, a faint bitterness on the tongue, metallic and dry. The older traders began glancing toward the south, their brows furrowed. A thin line of darkness had appeared on the horizon, growing as if the earth itself were lifting into the sky. Sandstorm, his uncle Mafio muttered, tightening the scarf around his face. The warning rippled through the caravan. Drivers urged camels to kneel. Men lashed coverings over crates and water skins. Marco's father grabbed his arm. "Stay close. Do not lose sight of us." The storm came like a living beast, roaring and howling, the sky darkening to a bruised yellow. The wind struck first, a wall of air so strong it shoved Marco sideways. Then came the sand, 1,000 needles stinging his skin, forcing tears from his eyes. The world shrank to a few feet in every direction, everything else swallowed by a swirling chaos of grit. Marco tried to breathe, but the air was thick, dry, choking. He pulled his cloak over his face, but still the sand found its way in, under his collar, into his hair, between his teeth. Around him, the camels groaned and shifted, their handlers shouting through the wind, voices lost almost immediately. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Marco's vision swam. He could feel the pull of panic at the edges of his mind. Then, through the curtain of sand, a hand grabbed his shoulder, his father's grip, strong and certain. Together, they crouched behind a camel's broad flank, using its bulk as a shield until the worst of the wind began to fade. When at last the air cleared, the desert lay transformed. Dunes had shifted, erasing the trail behind them. The camp looked half-buried, their supplies dusted in a fine layer of gold. Men coughed and spat grit. Water skins were passed from hand to trembling hand. One merchant wept quietly over a lost pack animal. That night, the caravan moved only a short distance before making camp. The air was cool again, almost gentle, as if apologizing for its violence. Marco lay awake, staring at the stars, and realized something that chilled him more than the night air. In this land, survival was never guaranteed. The desert was not a path to be crossed. It was a power to be endured. The morning after the storm was eerily calm. The desert stretched out smooth and unbroken, as if the chaos of the previous day had been a fever dream. Yet the faces of the caravan told another story, skin chafed raw, eyes red from grit, lips cracked from thirst. Even the camels moved slower, their long lashes still caked with sand. Marco walked through the camp, handing out small cups of water from one of their preserved skins. The taste was warm and faintly bitter, but it revived men enough to lift their heads. His father and uncle were already inspecting their goods, muttering in low voices about the damage. 2 crates of Venetian glass beads had shattered in the chaos. fine silk bundles were stiff with sand. In Venice, such losses would have been costly. Here, on the edge of Asia, they could be disastrous. By midday, they had reorganized and pushed on, following a path marked only by the instinct of the lead guide, a gaunt man with eyes like flint who seemed to read the desert the way a sailor reads the sea. Hours passed in a rhythm of slow movement and silence, until, near the horizon, dark shapes began to shimmer. At first, Marco thought it was another mirage, but as they drew closer, the shapes solidified into another caravan. Larger than theirs, its camels draped in crimson and gold, riders armed with curved sabers and bows. The two groups slowed as they approached, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Their leader emerged, a tall man with a turban of deep indigo, his skin weathered by years of sun. His eyes scanned the Polo's caravan with the calm precision of someone weighing the worth of both goods and men. He spoke in a rolling tongue that Marco couldn't follow, but his father responded in a halting mix of Persian and Arabic. Words passed back and forth, guarded, polite, edged with testing. It soon became clear this was no ordinary merchant band. They were envoys of a local emir, tasked with collecting tribute from traders crossing this section of the desert. It was a political choke point, pass without permission, and you risked disappearing into the sands forever. Niccolò Polo's face remained calm, but Marco caught the tightness in his jaw. To pay tribute meant losing part of their profits. To refuse meant courting danger they could not afford. In the end, they offered a chest of Venetian glassware and a bolt of fine wool, enough to satisfy the emir's men without gutting their resources. The exchange was tense, but ended without blood. As the crimson and gold caravan faded into the horizon, Marco's uncle muttered, "Remember this place. The desert may be endless, but power still carves borders here." That night, as the camp settled, Marco sat by the fire, turning over the lesson in his mind. The world was not just a map of distances, but of invisible lines drawn by men with the strength, or ruthlessness, to hold them. The road ahead was still long, and now he knew it would not only be the elements they would have to survive. The change came slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The endless dunes began to break into patches of gravel and scrub, the wind carrying with it a faint scent that Marco had not known for weeks, the scent of grass. The sun was still fierce, but its heat was tempered by occasional clouds drifting like pale sails across the sky. The caravan's pace quickened, as if the camels themselves could sense the promise of greener lands. By the fourth day, the desert had given way to rolling hills of ochre and green. The land lifted steadily, the air becoming cooler, crisper. And then, one afternoon, they crested a ridge and saw it, the Persian Plateau. A vast expanse of fertile plains and distant mountains, dotted with settlements that shimmered like jewels in the sun. Marco could not take his eyes from the sight. He had heard the word Persia in the stories of merchants back in Venice, always spoken with a mix of awe and envy. Now here it was, not a tale, but a living, breathing world before him. The cities were unlike anything he had seen, domes tiled in turquoise and gold, minarets spiraling toward the sky, markets sprawling like labyrinths under silken awnings. Their first stop was Tabriz, a city that seemed to hum with the pulse of 100 nations. The streets were crowded with traders from India, Arabia, China, and lands Marco could not name. The air was thick with the scent of saffron and roasting lamb, the sound of hammered copper, and the calls of hawkers selling everything from Persian carpets to fine steel blades. Even the animals seemed exotic. Tall white horses with flowing manes and small, long-eared donkeys carrying loads twice their size. In Tabriz, the Polos found rest, food, and a chance to repair their battered goods. But rest was brief. On their second evening, as they dined in the courtyard of a merchant's home, a stranger approached. He was richly dressed, his robe embroidered with golden thread, his beard oiled and trimmed with precision. His eyes lingered on Marco before settling on Niccolò. "You are travelers from the west," the man said in flawless Persian, which Niccolò could just follow. "Your goods are fine, but it is your destination that interests me." Niccolò hesitated. "And why is that?" The man smiled faintly, the kind of smile that reveals nothing. "Because the road you seek is watched, and because I hold a letter from men who would seize safely to the court of Kublai Khan." At the mention of the Khan's name, the air between them seemed to shift. Mafio leaned forward. "And these men, who are they?" The stranger produced a small parchment, sealed with an unfamiliar crest. "Friends," he said simply. "Powerful friends." That night, Marco lay awake, staring at the carved wooden ceiling of their chamber. The desert had tested their bodies, but now the road ahead would test their alliances and their trust. The invitation was tempting, perhaps even necessary. But every gift in these lands seemed to carry a hidden cost. They left to breeze under a sky the color of molten copper, riding with a caravan unlike any they had joined before. The crimson and gold silks of its banners fluttered in the breeze, but there was no mistaking its purpose. This was not a merchant's train, but an armed procession. Every rider bore a curved sword at his hip and a bow across his back, quivers bristling with arrows. The camels carried not only goods but sealed chests, guarded as if they held the breath of kings. Marco rode between his father and uncle, feeling the eyes of the soldiers on him. They were not unfriendly, but neither were they careless. Every gesture was measured. Every movement carried the quiet authority of men who had seen too much of the road and the blade. Their mysterious benefactor, the man with the golden-threaded robe, traveled near the front. He said little, but his presence carried weight. His name, they had learned, was Sayyid Arman, an intermediary for the Ilkhanate's court, where the Mongol rulers governed Persia in the Khan's name. His friends, it seemed, were high enough in the chain of power to smooth the path toward Kublai's distant realm. The road wound through valleys shadowed by the jagged Alborz mountains. Villages clung to the hillsides, their mud brick homes stacked like steps. Children chased the caravan barefoot, calling out in a sing-song Persian Marco could not understand. At night, they camped beside streams where the water ran icy cold, the stars so bright they seemed within reach. But the journey was not without its shadows. Twice they passed burned-out settlements, the air still faintly carrying the bitter scent of ash. Once, a group of riders appeared on a ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the setting sun. They watched in silence, then melted away before the caravan's guards could approach. Arman's expression never changed, but the next day the pace quickened, and the guards kept their hands closer to their weapons. One evening, as Marco tended the camels, he overheard two guards whispering in Turkic. The words were foreign, but the tone carried the unmistakable weight of caution. When he later asked his uncle, Mafio shook his head. "These roads," he murmured, "are paved with bargains made in whispers. Some you hear, most you don't." On the 12th day, they reached a fortified city whose gates rose high as castle walls. Arman spoke briefly to the guards. The gates swung open. Inside, the streets were narrow and crowded, the air thick with the scent of cardamom, dust, and human sweat. Here, the Mongol presence was visible. Banners bearing the falcon emblem hung over the main square, and armored riders patrolled in pairs. That night, in the upper room of a caravanserai, Arman finally spoke of what lay ahead. "You will travel with me until we reach Hormuz," he said, his gaze steady. "From there, you may take the sea to India or the land road through the Khan's territories. But remember this, every step east brings you closer to power and further from the world you knew." Marco listened in silence, feeling the weight of those words settle in his bones. The road to Kublai Khan was opening, but so too were the doors to dangers he could not yet name. The journey south began with the scent of salt long before the ocean itself came into view. Days passed in a shifting tapestry of landscapes, rugged hills descending into dry plains, then giving way to a wind-scoured emptiness where only the hardiest shrubs clung to life. The heat here was heavier, more oppressive than the Persian plateau. It pressed down like an invisible hand, baking the earth into cracked patterns beneath the caravan's feet. Marco had never seen the desert meet the sea. In his mind, water belonged to green shores, to Venice's winding canals and the gentle rocking of gondolas. But this coast was different. When the caravan crested the final ridge and Hormuz appeared, it was like stepping into a dream painted in impossible colors. The city glittered under the sun, whitewashed walls, domes painted in deep lapis, and the harbor crowded with ships of every shape and rigging. The air was thick with the scent of spices, cinnamon, black pepper, frankincense, and something sharper, almost metallic. Traders shouted in a dozen tongues, their voices mingling with the creak of rigging and the cries of seabirds. The ocean stretched beyond, an endless plain of silver blue, its surface shifting like hammered steel. Hormuz was a crossroads of the known world. Marco saw Indian merchants with jeweled turbans unloading sacks of pepper, tall men from Africa leading camels burdened with ivory and gold, Chinese sailors rolling out silk bolts that shimmered like flowing water. The city's streets were a living mosaic of cultures, each alley hiding a new scent and new story. But Hormuz was also a place of whispers. That first night, as they dined in the shaded courtyard of a wealthy merchant, Armin revealed the reason they had come. "From here," he said, "the choice is yours. The sea will carry you swiftly east, but it is treacherous. Pirates prowl the waters, storms rise without warning. The land road is longer, harder, but safer for those who can endure it." Nicolo leaned back, considering. "And what would you choose?" Armin's dark eyes gleamed. "I choose what I am paid to choose. But for you..." He let the sentence hang in the air like incense smoke. The Khan's court favors those who arrive bearing tales of survival, not tales of convenience. Marco felt the weight of the decision. The sea called to him with the promise of speed and adventure, but he had heard enough to know that a single storm could end their story forever. The land road was grueling. Mountains, deserts, and hostile borders, but it would take them deep into the heart of Asia, along the arteries of the Silk Road. That night, unable to sleep, Marco wandered down to the harbor. He watched the moonlight dance on the water, listened to the groan of ships at anchor. Somewhere beyond the horizon was Kublai Khan, the man whose name had carried them this far, and whose shadow seemed to stretch across the world. By dawn, the decision was made. The Polos would take the land road. The caravan left Hormuz at first light, when the sky was still washed in pale gold and the air carried a fragile coolness. The city's domes faded behind them, swallowed by the rising heat haze. Ahead stretched the Dasht-i-Lut, the empty desert, a place spoken of in fearful tones by sailors and traders alike. Even the wind seemed to hesitate here. By midday, the coolness was gone. The sun hammered the earth with such force that the air shimmered. Sand crunched underfoot, the sound dry and brittle, as though it might splinter to dust. The camels plodded on with stoic endurance, their shadows shrinking beneath them until they seemed part of the animals' legs. Marco's lips cracked. Every breath felt like inhaling the heat of an open forge. At night, the world transformed. The heat bled away, replaced by a chill so sharp it bit through layers of cloth. The desert sky was a black vault pricked with a billion stars, so bright that Marco thought he could lose himself in them. The silence here was total, no rustle of leaves, no trickle of water, only the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. On the fifth day, a dust storm struck without warning. The horizon darkened, the wind roared, and the air turned to a choking wall of sand. Armin shouted orders, but his voice was snatched away. Marco wrapped a cloth around his face, clinging to his camel's saddle as the world became nothing but a blind, stinging chaos. Hours later, when the storm passed, 2 camels were gone, swallowed by the desert, and one guard lay buried in a shallow drift, his face as still as the dunes. It was on the 7th day that they saw them, the Mongol riders. They appeared first as dark shapes against the horizon, moving in perfect formation. As they drew closer, Marco saw the glint of sunlight on lamellar armor, the bowstrings strung tight, the faces impassive beneath fur-lined helmets. They rode small but powerful horses, each animal's breath steaming in the early morning chill. Not a single rider broke formation, not even to glance at the caravan. The leader, a man with a hawk feather crest on his helmet, rode forward. He spoke in a language Marco did not understand, but Armin replied smoothly, his words flowing like water. The leader's gaze shifted to Marco. Young, foreign, his Venetian features stark against the desert backdrop. The moment stretched, then the leader nodded once, sharply, and signaled his men. The Mongols wheeled as one and vanished into the horizon, leaving only a lingering sense of measured power. That night, by the campfire, Armin said quietly, "You've just seen the Khan's eyes and ears. His reach is longer than any sword, and his silence is sharper than steel." Marco stared into the flames, realizing for the first time that their journey was not simply about reaching the Khan's court. They were already inside his shadow. The first sight of green was almost a hallucination. After weeks of blinding gold and scorched stone, the shimmer of trees on the horizon seemed impossible. Yet, as the caravan drew closer, the mirage solidified into reality, tall poplars swaying in the breeze, water flashing like a vein of silver through the earth, and fields thick with barley. The oasis smelled of life, damp soil, wild mint, and the faint sweetness of ripening melons. They had reached one of the great arteries of the Silk Road, a place where East and West met not in battle, but in trade and survival. Merchants from Samarkand bartered with Persians. Uyghur horsemen watered their mounts beside Kashmiri traders unrolling lengths of saffron cloth. Here, the caravan was no longer a lonely line of travelers. It was one among many, swept along in a river of commerce that carried the wealth of empires. But with the prosperity came control. At the far edge of the oasis stood a gatehouse of heavy timber and packed earth, its walls adorned with fluttering banners marked with the falcon emblem of the Khan. Mongol soldiers, their armor dusty but well-kept, lounged in the shade, but their eyes missed nothing. The captain of the guard, a stocky man with a weathered face, stepped forward. His gaze swept over the caravan, lingering on the bales of silk and chests of goods. Armin dismounted, producing a sealed letter. The captain broke the wax, his eyes moving quickly over the script before grunting and handing it back. A sharp whistle brought two more soldiers, who began inspecting each camel, counting crates, even weighing sacks of spice. Marco noticed that nothing passed unnoticed, not the smallest trinket, not the faintest shift of expression. The Mongols ruled not only with their armies, but with an administrative precision that seemed woven into the road itself. By late afternoon, they were led into the governor's compound, a low palace of whitewashed walls, tiled roofs, and shaded courtyards. Inside, the air was cool, scented with cedar and dried jasmine. The governor himself was a man in his 40s, lean and sharp-eyed, wearing a robe of indigo silk and a belt inlaid with silver. "You are the Venetians," he said in accented Persian, his voice even but carrying authority. "The Khan has been told of your journey. Few from your lands have traveled this far. Fewer still have done so with purpose." Nicolo bowed slightly. "Our purpose is friendship and understanding." The governor's lips curved in something between a smile and a test. "Then you will understand this. The road ahead is the Khan's road. You travel under his sky, you drink his water, you walk on his soil. That means you travel by his leave." The meeting ended with formal courtesies, but Marco felt the weight of the governor's words long after they left. The Mongol Empire was not merely vast, it was tightly bound by loyalty, law, and watchfulness. Here, far from Venice, they were already walking in the Khan's shadow. That night, as they camped by the oasis, Marco wrote in his journal under the moonlight. The stars above were the same as those over Venice, but here they seemed to belong to another world entirely, a world where one man's rule stretched across deserts, mountains, and oceans. The land began to rise in slow, deceptive swells, each hill leading to another, steeper still. By the third day, the soft brown earth gave way to rock, the air thinning with each mile. The sun still shone, but it was a cold, pale light now, the kind that failed to warm the skin. By the time they reached the first pass, the wind had sharpened into knives. It sliced through wool, through leather, through flesh, leaving skin raw and breath short. The camels, so steady on the desert plains, grew skittish on the narrow trails, their padded feet slipping on patches of ice. Men walked with heads bowed, faces wrapped in cloth, every step a fight against both gravity and the bitter wind. Marco had read of mountains, their majesty, their danger, but no page could have prepared him for this. The peaks loomed like stone fortresses, their summits hidden in veils of snow. Every sound seemed to vanish in the white silence, broken only by the crack of ice underfoot and the dull chime of the lead camel's bell. One night, as they camped in a narrow ravine, the temperature fell so suddenly that water froze in the pot before it could boil. Marco woke to find his beard stiff with frost, his breath forming small clouds in the dim glow of the coals. Nico Lo checked the animals, his hands blue at the fingertips. Armin muttered a prayer in Persian, eyes scanning the peaks as if expecting the mountains themselves to shift in the night. The fourth day brought the worst, a cliffside trail no wider than a man's shoulders, with sheer drops on one side and jagged rock on the other. A slip here meant death, no question. The wind roared down the valley, carrying with it a fine powder of snow that stung like glass against the skin. Marco clung to the rock wall, fingers numb inside his gloves, heart hammering. The world seemed reduced to three things: the cold, the wind, and the next step forward. By the time they descended into the next valley, they were different men. Weaker in body, perhaps, but sharpened in will. The mountains had tested them, and let them pass for now. But Marco could not shake the feeling that the road ahead would demand even more. That night, as they set camp beside a frozen stream, the stars emerged in a sky so clear it felt infinite. Marco looked at them and wondered, how far could a man go before the world itself turned him into someone unrecognizable? When the mountains finally loosened their grip, the land opened into a vast plain, but it was not the kind Marco had imagined. It was white, endless, shimmering white, stretching in every direction until sky and earth seemed to merge in a pale blur. The snow was deep here, but frozen hard enough to bear the weight of men and animals. Each step crunched like the breaking of glass. The air carried a strange, ringing stillness. Even the wind moved differently now, a low, constant hum rather than the screaming gusts of the high passes. The cold was no less cruel, but it had a certain clarity to it. Marco could see for miles, and yet there was almost nothing to see. It was as if they had stepped into the blank page of a story not yet written. By midday, a shadow appeared on the horizon. At first it was only a smudge against the white, but it grew steadily until it resolved into moving figures, horsemen, fast and direct. Their approach stirred a haze of frost that sparkled in the low winter sun. The Mongols came in silence, their horses' hooves muffled by the snow. They were dressed for the cold, fur-lined coats, leather gauntlets, and high boots crusted with ice. Their faces were wrapped in wool, revealing only eyes sharp as the edges of drawn steel. The leader dismounted before the caravan. His movements were precise, efficient, like a man used to command. Armin spoke to him in the Mongol tongue, his breath fogging in the cold air. Marco could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. This was a checkpoint, and they were being weighed, measured. The leader's gaze moved over each man, pausing on Marco with a flicker of curiosity. Then, without warning, he gestured to the east. Armin translated, "The road is clear, and if your feet are fast enough, you may see something worth remembering." They rode on, the horizon slowly changing. What began as a faint line grew into the silhouette of low, sprawling walls, not stone, but a dark timber rising from the frozen earth. Smoke rose in thin streams from within, and even at this distance Marco could sense movement, the hum of a living place. Armin's voice was almost reverent. "That is one of the Khan's winter camps." Marco stared, unable to look away. It was not the capital. It was not the court. But it was the first real heartbeat of the empire they had crossed deserts, mountains, and death to reach. And something in that sight told him the journey had only just begun. The camp rose before them like an apparition in the white expanse, a city without stone, alive yet impermanent. The walls were low and practical, a mere suggestion of boundaries, but within them the world pulsed with activity. Dozens upon dozens of yurts, round, felt-covered tents, stood in ordered circles, their smoke holes sending slender plumes into the pale winter sky. As Marco stepped through the wide wooden gate, the first thing that struck him was the sound. The dull thud of mallets driving stakes, the sharp ring of steel being honed, the guttural rhythm of the Mongol tongue in bargaining, laughter, or command. It was a living organism, each man, woman, and child moving with a purpose that seemed instinctive. Children darted between yurts, wrapped in thick furs, their cheeks red from the cold. Women tended to fires, their hands quick and sure, boiling broths thick with meat and root vegetables. The scent, rich, earthy, and heavy with smoke, wrapped itself around the newcomers, a welcome change from the sterile cold of the plains. Soldiers moved in small knots, their fur caps pulled low, bows slung across their backs. Each man's eyes lingered on the Venetians just long enough to signal both curiosity and suspicion. No one here was without a role, and strangers without clear purpose were, at best, tolerated. Armin led them to the center of the camp, where a larger yurt stood, its felt dyed a deep crimson, the color of authority. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their armor a patchwork of leather, fur, and lamellar plates that gleamed faintly in the weak sunlight. One of them stepped forward, blocking the way, and barked something in Mongolian. "They want to know," Armin translated quietly, "why we are here, and whether we carry the Khan's favor." Nicolo reached into his pack and produced a small, folded piece of parchment, stamped with the seal they had received from a lesser Mongol commander weeks earlier. The guard took it, studied the seal, and then looked at Marco, directly, as if measuring not just his face, but the weight of his intentions. Then, with deliberate slowness, the guard tore the parchment in half. The camp seemed to hold its breath. Marco's hand twitched toward his cloak, where his knife rested, but Nicolo's subtle shake of the head stopped him. The guard spoke again, this time with a trace of a smile beneath his fur hood. Armin's voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the tension. He says seals can be forged. Trust must be earned. The meaning was clear. Their passage deeper into Mongol lands depended not on the paper in their hands, but on what they would prove here, in this camp, under the watchful eyes of the Empire's winter soldiers. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the temperature dropped sharply, and the first stars began to pierce the fading light. Somewhere in the camp, a drum began to beat, slow, steady, like the pulse of a giant. Marco felt it in his chest. The test had begun, though he did not yet know its terms. Before dawn, the camp stirred like a great beast waking. The air was brittle, each breath a knife to the lungs. Men tightened saddle straps, checked bowstrings, and pulled quivers snug against their backs. Horses stamped in the snow, their nostrils steaming, manes crusted with frost. Marco was still rubbing the last remnants of sleep from his eyes when Armin appeared at the yurt flap, already dressed for the hunt, fur-lined coat belted tight, tall boots, and a curved Mongol bow slung across his back. "They've decided," he said simply. "You ride with them today. Bring down the winter stag, and you're welcome here. Fail," and he let the sentence trail off, the unspoken end as clear as the cold morning sky. The hunt party numbered 20. The Mongols rode with an ease that made horse and man seem one. Marco mounted his own steed, a stocky steppe pony built for endurance rather than speed, and tried to mimic their posture, though the bitter wind immediately gnawed at his face and fingers. They rode out into the vast white. The sun had barely risen, and the world was painted in shades of blue and silver. Tracks in the snow told silent stories, the delicate stitch of hare feet, the sweeping drag of a fox's tail, and, here and there, the deep, heart-shaped imprints of a stag. The leader of the hunt, a broad-shouldered man named Badu, raised a gloved hand, halting the group. He dismounted, knelt, and pressed his palm into one of the stag prints. When he rose, he said a single word in Mongolian. The others split into 2 flanking lines without hesitation. Marco followed the left wing, heart pounding in his chest. The silence of the steppe was deceptive. Beneath it lurked constant motion, the distant thunder of hooves, the rush of wind over snow, the whisper of bowstrings being flexed in readiness. Marco's every sense sharpened. Then it happened. A flicker of movement ahead, almost invisible against the snowy backdrop. The stag. It was enormous, its antlers like the branches of a winter bare tree, breath pluming in the cold. Bada gave a shout, and the hunt exploded into motion. Horses surged forward, hooves churning snow into white spray. Marco clung to the saddle, bow in hand, the world narrowing to the pounding of his mount's heart and the fleeing shape ahead. The stag darted left, leaping over a drift. Marco rose slightly in his stirrups, nocked an arrow, and pulled. The bowstring sang in the freezing air. His first shot flew wide, skimming the snow near the animal's feet. Bada glanced back briefly, no mockery in his eyes yet, but expectation heavy in the gaze. They closed the gap. Marco drew again, this time feeling the weight of the bow, the bite of the cold, the rhythm of the horse beneath him. He released. The arrow struck, not a killing blow, but enough to slow the animal. Bada surged ahead, his own arrow flying true, and the stag stumbled, then fell into the snow with a muffled crash. The rider circled, voices lifting in sharp, guttural cries of triumph. Bada dismounted, approached Marco, and extended a hand, a rare gesture among the Mongols. "You ride well for a stranger," Armin translated. Back in camp, the stag's hide and meat would feed families for days. Marco knew it wasn't just the hunt he had survived, it was the first true measure of acceptance. Before dawn, the camp stirred like a great beast waking. The air was brittle, each breath a knife to the lungs. Men tightened saddle straps, checked bowstrings, and pulled quivers snug against their backs. Horses stamped in the snow, their nostrils steaming, manes crusted with frost. Marco was still rubbing the last remnants of sleep from his eyes when Armin appeared at the yurt flap, already dressed for the hunt, fur-lined coat belted tight, tall boots, and a curved Mongol bow slung across his back. "They've decided," he said simply. "You ride with them today. Bring down the winter stag, and you are welcome here. Fail," and he let the sentence trail off, the unspoken end as clear as the cold morning sky. The hunt party numbered 20. The Mongols rode with an ease that made horse and man seem one. Marco mounted his own steed, a stocky steppe pony built for endurance rather than speed, and tried to mimic their posture, though the bitter wind immediately gnawed at his face and fingers. They rode out into the vast white. The sun had barely risen, and the world was painted in shades of blue and silver. Tracks in the snow told silent stories, the delicate stitch of hare feet, the sweeping drag of a fox's tail, and, here and there, the deep, heart-shaped imprints of a stag. The leader of the hunt, a broad-shouldered man named Badu, raised a gloved hand, halting the group. He dismounted, knelt, and pressed his palm into one of the stag prints. When he rose, he said a single word in Mongolian. The other split into two flanking lines without hesitation. Marco followed the left wing, heart pounding in his chest. The silence of the steppe was deceptive. Beneath it lurked constant motion, the distant thunder of hooves, the rush of wind over snow, the whisper of bowstrings being flexed in readiness. Marco's every sense sharpened. Then it happened. A flicker of movement ahead, almost invisible against the snowy backdrop. The stag. It was enormous, its antlers like the branches of a winter bare tree, breath pluming in the cold. Bada gave a shout, and the hunt exploded into motion. Horses surged forward, hooves churning snow into white spray. Marco clung to the saddle, bow in hand, the world narrowing to the pounding of his mount's heart and the fleeing shape ahead. The stag darted left, leaping over a drift. Marco rose slightly in his stirrups, nocked an arrow, and pulled. The bowstring sang in the freezing air. His first shot flew wide, skimming the snow near the animal's feet. Bada glanced back briefly, no mockery in his eyes yet, but expectation heavy in the gaze. They closed the gap. Marco drew again, this time feeling the weight of the bow, the bite of the cold, the rhythm of the horse beneath him. He released. The arrow struck, not a killing blow, but enough to slow the animal. Bada surged ahead, his own arrow flying true, and the stag stumbled, then fell into the snow with a muffled crash. The riders circled, voices lifting in sharp, guttural cries of triumph. Bada dismounted, approached Marco, and extended a hand, a rare gesture among the Mongols. "You ride well for a stranger," Armin translated. Back in camp, the stag's hide and meat would feed families for days. Marco knew it wasn't just the hunt he had survived. It was the first true measure of acceptance. Night descended on the steppe like a curtain of velvet, deep and absolute. The stars burned sharp and cold above the camp, their light scattering across the snow like shards of glass. In the heart of the settlement, a great fire crackled, its orange glow a small defiance against the winter's black breath. The men who had ridden in the hunt gathered in a wide circle around it, their heavy coats steaming as the frost melted from their fur. Laughter erupted in bursts, mingling with the smell of roasting meat, thick slices from the stag Marco had helped bring down. The fire's heat seeped into his bones, thawing fingers that had been numb since before dawn. Bada sat opposite him, tearing a strip of meat with his teeth, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. Between mouthfuls, he spoke in low, measured tones to the others. Marco caught only fragments, the cadence of Mongolian like the rise and fall of a drumbeat. Armin leaned close and whispered translations in his ear. "They speak of the Khan," Armin murmured, "and of the council in Karakoram. There is unrest. A cousin of the Khan grows too ambitious." Marco kept his face neutral, though the words sent a flicker of intrigue through him. This was not idle gossip. For these warriors, loyalty and power were currency, and a shift in either could mean war across the steppe. One of the younger riders, broad-faced, with a scar bisecting his brow, leaned forward and thrust a wooden cup toward Marco. The drink inside was steaming and sour-smelling. "Kumis," Armin said. "Fermented mare's milk. Drink, and they will take you as one of their own." The liquid burned his throat and left a taste both sharp and earthy, but the effect was immediate. A roar of approval rose from the circle, and someone clapped him on the back hard enough to jolt the breath from his lungs. As the night deepened, stories flowed. Tales of hunts, battles, and omens read in the movement of herds or the shifting winds. Then Bada fixed his gaze on Marco and spoke a question. Armin hesitated before translating. "He asks," Armin said quietly, "if you ride for trade or for something greater." Marco met Bada's eyes. He could feel the weight of the question, the way it seemed to ripple through the firelit circle. Every ear was turned toward him. The wrong answer might end his welcome here. The right one could open doors all the way to the Khan's tent. "I ride," Marco said slowly, "to see the world as it is and as it might be." Bada's stare held for a long moment, then his mouth curved into the faintest smile. He tore another piece of meat and tossed it across the fire to Marco. The night went on, the fire burning low, the warriors slipping into song, low, resonant chants that seemed older than the empire itself. Yet behind the warmth and camaraderie, Marco sensed the quiet tension of men who lived close to power and closer still to danger. The fire had long since burned to embers when Marco was roused by a hand on his shoulder. The yurt was dark, the only light the faint glow of dying coals. Armin's voice was a low hiss. "Come." Quietly. Marco pulled on his fur-lined coat and boots, the chill immediately biting through the fabric. Outside, the steppe was wrapped in a heavy pre-dawn mist. The camp lay silent, save for the muffled snort of a restless horse and the creak of wooden frames under frost. Armin led him away from the main circle of yurts, their steps crunching in the snow. They stopped at a small, low structure at the edge of camp, half hidden in the shadow of a ridge. Inside, a single oil lamp cast trembling light over a map spread on a rough wooden table. Badu was there. Gone was the easy camaraderie of the hunt or the warmth of the fire. His expression was carved from stone. He gestured for Marco to step closer. "This," Armin translated, pointing to the map, is the winter route to Karakoram, the Khan's city. Normally guarded, but this year, there are fewer patrols. The council is distracted. That is why we ride. Marco's eyes traced the winding lines, the drawn mountains and rivers. Karakoram, the name itself was a lure, a place out of legend, the seat of the great Khan's power. Bada's finger moved to a mark near the city. A cousin of the Khan gathers men here. Traitors, mercenaries, anyone who will take his coin. He claims loyalty, but seeks the throne. The warrior's gaze bored into Marco. You are foreign. You can pass unnoticed where we cannot. You will carry words for me to a man inside the city. He will know what to do. Marco hesitated. The journey alone would be dangerous, but the implication was clear. This was not simple courier work. It was intrigue at the heart of an empire that punished betrayal with death. Why me? He asked. Bada leaned forward, his voice low but steady. Because you ride for more than trade. And because, stranger, you have not yet learned fear. The lamp guttered in the cold draft, shadows rippling over the map. Marco felt the weight of the choice before him. This mission could bring him closer to the Khan, or end his journey entirely. Outside, the eastern horizon had begun to pale, a thin line of silver above the snow. Bada folded the map, tucking it into a leather pouch, and pressed it into Marco's hands. Leave when the camp sleeps again, he said. And remember, in Karakoram, not all smiles are friendly. The camp lay shrouded in silence when Marco slipped away. His horse's breath steamed in the frozen air, each exhale curling like a spirit in the moonlight. He had left before the sun could stain the horizon, choosing darkness as his ally. The leather pouch Badu had given him hung beneath his cloak, the map inside pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The steppes stretched endlessly before him, a white, unbroken plain under a sky of cold iron. The snow crunched beneath the hooves, but otherwise the world seemed hushed, as if it held its breath. Only the wind spoke, whistling low and constant, slicing through his furs with an edge that made his bones ache. By midday, the sky began to bruise. Heavy clouds rolled in from the north, their shadows swallowing the light. Marco urged his horse onward, but the first flakes began to fall, slow at first, then faster, until the air was a white blur. The wind rose, carrying the sting of ice. He wrapped his scarf higher over his face, leaving only his eyes to the storm. Hours passed without a landmark in sight. The snow erased all distinction between ground and sky. He could no longer tell whether he rode across a frozen plain or into the belly of a cloud. Only the memory of the map in his mind kept him moving in what he hoped was the right direction. By nightfall, the storm had deepened into a blizzard. His horse stumbled more than once, nostrils flaring as it fought for breath in the choking white. Marco found shelter in the lee of a jagged outcrop, a rare break in the endless flatness. He dismounted, hands numb, and scraped away snow to make a hollow for the fire. The flames sputtered in the wind, but at last took hold. Marco huddled close, teeth clenched against the shivering that racked his body. He thought of Venice, of the damp salt air and the crowded markets, of warmth that seemed now like a dream from another life. Here, the steppe seemed determined to strip him to his core, to see what would remain once every comfort was gone. The storm howled through the night, a beast prowling just beyond the firelight. Once, he thought he heard the distant howl of wolves, carried on the wind. The sound vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only the relentless rush of snow. When dawn finally broke, it did so without color, just a pale light seeping through the storm's thinning veil. Marco mounted again, legs stiff, and pushed on. His water was nearly gone, frozen in its skin, and the food Badu had given him was hard as stone. He chewed what he could, swallowing against the ache in his jaw. 2 days passed in this rhythm: ride, search for shelter, fight the cold, keep moving. The world had narrowed to these simple tasks. Yet with each mile, the mountains on the horizon grew sharper, their black ridges cutting into the sky. Somewhere beyond them lay Karakoram and the man Badu had sent him to find. But in the steppe, every promise lay behind a trial. And Marco knew the next one was already waiting. By the third evening, the mountains loomed like the jagged teeth of some slumbering beast. Their peaks were shrouded in veils of ice clouds, and the passes between them glimmered faintly under the ghostly moonlight. Marco's breath hung heavy, and his horse's flanks steamed in the biting cold. The path narrowed to a ribbon of frozen rock, winding upward. Below, the steppe stretched into infinity, a white ocean he had already conquered. Above, the pass awaited, and beyond it, Karakoram. But the air here was different. It carried a stillness that wasn't born of nature. Halfway through the climb, the stillness broke. A whistle, sharp, deliberate, sliced through the wind. Marco reined in, eyes searching the jagged slopes. From the shadows, they emerged. For riders, wrapped in layered furs, their faces masked by thick scarves and eyes as cold as the steel of their curved sabers. The leader's horse was a black stallion, its breath fogging in heavy bursts. He spoke in clipped Mongolian, the tone leaving no doubt it was a command. Marco raised his hands slightly, keeping them away from his belt knife, and answered in the few Mongol words he knew. The man's gaze narrowed. Arrows rested lazily against the bowstrings of two riders, the way a wolf rests its paw over a kill. The leader spurred his horse closer, circling Marco, the sound of hooves crunching on ice. His eyes caught on the leather pouch under Marco's cloak. Marco's heartbeat thundered. Bada's warning echoed in his mind. Not all smiles are friendly. The leader's gloved hand extended. A silent demand. Marco hesitated only a fraction of a second, but in that instant, one of the bowmen drew the string taut, the arrow tip glittering in the moonlight. With slow deliberation, Marco pulled the pouch free, but instead of handing it over, he let it drop to the snow between them. The leader dismounted, bending to retrieve it. As he straightened, the wind shifted, a sudden howl that carried the distant sound of hooves. More riders coming fast. The patrol leader froze, his gaze flicking toward the pass. For one tense heartbeat, no one moved. Then, with a barked order, the patrol mounted again and vanished into the crags, taking the pouch with them. Marco stood in the snow, breath ragged, the thunder of approaching riders growing louder. Shapes emerged from the mist, fur-clad warriors under a crimson banner. At their head rode a woman in a wolfskin hood, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She reined in beside Marco, her gaze sweeping over him. "You ride for Karakoram," she said in crisp, accented Latin. "And you've just lost something very important." Before Marco could answer, she gestured for him to follow. The riders turned toward the pass, the crimson banner snapping in the icy wind. Marco took one last look at the empty snow where the pouch had fallen, then urged his horse forward. Somewhere beyond these frozen peaks lay the city, and now, a dangerous debt to repay. The gates of Karakoram rose from the white plain like the ribs of some colossal beast buried in snow. Towers of dark timber and stone framed a massive archway carved with snarling lions and the curling script of the Mongol court. Marco reined in just beyond the shadow of the walls, his breath catching, not from the cold, but from the sheer enormity of the moment. He had heard of this city in whispers and half-remembered tales, a jewel of the steppe, the beating heart of an empire whose riders had touched the edge of the known world. Now, the walls loomed before him, black against the pallid sky, banners snapping like whips in the wind. The woman in the wolfskin hood, his silent guide for the last day's ride, did not pause. She urged her horse forward, and the guards, hard-faced men with lamellar armor and curved sabers at their hips, stepped aside with the wariness of those who recognized her authority. Within the gates, Karakoram unfolded like a tapestry. Narrow lanes wound between merchant stalls heavy with goods from every corner of the empire, silks from Cathay, Persian glass, furs from Siberia, spices from India. The air was thick with scents that warred for dominance, roasting lamb, incense, the tang of iron and leather. But the grandeur was not in the markets alone. At the city center rose the Khan's palace, a sprawling structure of carved wood, gilded beams, and sweeping eaves that caught the pale light like the wings of a great bird. Smoke curled from its chimneys into the frozen air. The sound of distant drums rolled across the city, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of the realm. Marco followed his guide through the throng, every detail imprinting itself on his mind. Here, a trader haggled in Arabic with a fur merchant. There, a shaman in wolf pelts read omens in a bowl of dark liquid. Children darted through the crowd, their laughter mingling with the guttural cadence of Mongolian speech and the clang of a distant forge. The palace gate stood open, flanked by two colossal statues of warriors astride rearing horses. Inside, warmth struck him, the rich scent of burning cedar and the low murmur of voices in the great hall. The floor was laid with intricate rugs, their patterns telling stories of conquest and divine favor. At the far end of the hall, upon a dais draped in crimson and gold, sat Kublai Khan. He was not the barbarian king of Western imagination, but a man of measured presence. His robe shimmered with silk embroidery, a crown of beaten gold resting lightly upon his head. His eyes, sharp, assessing, fixed on Marco as though weighing the worth of his soul. The woman in the wolfskin had stepped forward, speaking in fluid Mongolian. Marco understood nothing, but he caught the subtle shifts in tone, the introduction, the vouching for his presence. When she stepped aside, silence filled the hall, broken only by the steady crackle of the brazier fires. A translator stepped forward, his voice clear and unhurried. Khan asks, "What have you seen, Venetian, that was worth crossing the world to stand here before him?" Marco felt the weight of every mile behind him, the deserts, the mountains, the biting wind of the steppe. He thought of Bada's lost pouch, the crimson banner, the eyes of the patrol leader. He chose his words carefully. "I have seen," he said slowly, "a world greater than I was told existed, and I have not yet seen its heart." A faint smile ghosted across the Khan's lips. He spoke again, and the translator's words fell like a challenge. "Then you will. But know this. Those who enter the heart of the empire do not leave unchanged." The drums outside quickened. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, riders thundered into the city, bringing news that would set the next storm in motion. The wind on the steppe had changed. It no longer carried the crisp bite of winter alone. It carried whispers. Whispers of war brewing far to the south, of restlessness in the Khan's distant provinces, of rivals sharpening their knives in the dark. Marco Polo stood on the balcony of a guest chamber high within the palace, watching banners ripple in the cold light. The drums were silent now. That silence was more unsettling than their steady beat had ever been. Kublai Khan summoned him at dawn. The audience chamber was lit only by braziers, their flames twisting in the shadows. The Khan sat forward on his throne, eyes burning with a quiet urgency. A rolled parchment lay before him, bound in red silk. "You have crossed deserts and mountains for knowledge," the translator murmured on the Khan's behalf. "Now you will carry knowledge across them again. This is not for my generals, not for my ministers. This is for my blood." The parchment was placed in Marco's hands. It was heavier than it should have been, as though it carried not just words, but the weight of destinies. The Khan's gaze locked with his, a silent warning that the road ahead would demand more than endurance. By the next morning, Marco was riding out of Karakorum with a small escort, 2 Mongol riders whose eyes missed nothing, and the woman in the wolfskin hood who had first brought him here. The city gates closed behind them like the jaws of a beast. The journey was relentless. Frozen rivers groaned under the hooves of their horses, ice cracking in the pre-dawn chill. In the mountain passes, the wind screamed through the rocks like a living thing. At night, they camped in the ruins of watchtowers, their fires throwing shadows against ancient stone. But the road was not empty. In the foothills, they found a caravan torn apart, wagons burned, goods scattered, bodies stiff in the snow. The wolfskin woman knelt beside one of the dead, her face unreadable. "Bandits," the translator said flatly. But the precision of the attack told Marco otherwise. This had been no raid for plunder. It had been a warning. Days later, as they crossed a narrow valley, riders appeared on the ridges, black silhouettes against the white sky. Arrows fell like rain. The escort broke into a gallop, Marco clutching the precious parchment beneath his cloak. One Mongol rider went down, his cry swallowed by the wind. They did not stop until nightfall, when the sky burned with stars. The wolfskin woman took the first watch, her bow across her knees. Marco lay awake, listening to the distant howl of wolves and wondering if they were the only hunters in the dark. Weeks later, battered by cold, hunger, and pursuit, they reached the shores of the Caspian. The sea spread out before them like liquid silver under the pale sun. Somewhere beyond it lay the road west, and with it, the chance to deliver the Khan's words to their rightful heir. On the night before they sailed, the wolfskin woman handed him a small bundle, a pouch of fine red silk. Inside was a single jade coin, etched with the symbol of the Khan. "If you live," she said quietly, "this will bring you back. If you do not, it will tell them you tried." Marco stared at the coin long after she walked away, the wind from the sea tugging at his cloak. Behind him lay the greatest empire he had ever known, and perhaps the only true home he had found far from Venice. Ahead lay the long road back, a road that would test whether the man who had entered the heart of the empire was the same man who could leave it. As the ship's anchor broke free from the icy shore at dawn, Marco looked back one last time. The steppe was a line of shadow against the rising sun, the banners of the Khan nothing more than threads in the distance. But the weight of his journey, of what he carried, would never fade. Somewhere in the folds of his cloak, the red silk pouch pressed against his heart, a silent promise that the story was not over. The wind off the Adriatic carried the scent of salt and memory. After 24 years of chasing horizons, Marco Polo was returning to the city of his birth, a city that might not remember him, and perhaps one he could barely remember himself. The galley's prow cut through the gray-green water, the creak of its timbers mingling with the sigh of the sails. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries sharp against the distant silhouette of Venice's spires. The journey back had been anything but serene. From the jeweled palaces of Kanbalik to the endless steppes, from the dust-laden bazaars of Persia to the perilous ports of the Levant, every mile had been shadowed by loss. His father, Niccolò, and Uncle Maffeo had weathered storms and sickness beside him, but the years had taken their toll. By the time they reached Trebizond, the old fire in their eyes had dimmed. They were men returning not to glory, but to a reckoning. The Adriatic's waters darkened as a storm gathered on the horizon. The crew, hardened by months at sea, moved with brisk precision, securing ropes, tightening sails. Marco stood at the bow, his cloak whipping in the wind, eyes fixed on a horizon that seemed to retreat with every wave. Somewhere beneath the roar of the sea, memories whispered, the laughter of the Khan's court, the rustle of silk, the distant clang of Mongol forges. When the storm broke, it was with the fury of an empire collapsing. Waves slammed against the hull, salt spray blinding the deckhands as they fought to keep the vessel from capsizing. Thunder rolled like distant cannon fire, lightning illuminating faces etched with fear. Marco clung to the railing, the cold biting into his hands. Each flash of light brought visions, the burning cities of Persia, the skeletal faces of famine-stricken villages, the jeweled throne room where Kublai Khan's gaze had once held him captive. They survived the storm, but the calm that followed was uneasy. In the mess hall that night, the men spoke in low voices. Rumors had reached even these far waters. Venice was not as Marco had left it. The Genoese war had left scars, and in the shadows of its canals, new powers had risen. Old alliances had fractured. The name Polo was no longer spoken with universal respect. Some called them traitors for serving the Khan. Others whispered that their tales were fabrications, that no man could have seen what Marco claimed to have seen. When at last Venice emerged from the morning mist, it was both familiar and alien. The golden mosaics of St. Mark's Basilica still caught the light, but the piazza was quieter than he remembered. Soldiers patrolled the docks, their armor glinting. Eyes followed the Polo galley as it moored, but there was no welcoming crowd. Instead, there was a stillness, the watchful stillness of a city deciding whether you were friend or foe. Marco's boots struck the stone quay, and the sound was like an echo from another life. His first steps into the city were shadowed by armed guards. An official approached, stern-faced, parchment in hand. The orders were brief and cold. Marco Polo was to present himself before the Council of 10 for questioning. No fanfare, no parade, just suspicion. In the days that followed, Marco found himself caught between two worlds. In the council chamber, he recounted his journeys, the jade towers of Xanadu, the thunder of Mongol cavalry, the markets of Kashgar where spices perfumed the air. He spoke not as a braggart, but as a witness to a world larger than Venice could imagine. Yet the more he spoke, the more skeptical the faces became. At night, in the Polo family home, the silence was heavier. The walls were lined with relics from the East, lacquered boxes, porcelain vases, bolts of silk, but they were mute testimony. His father was aging fast, his health failing. There were no banquets, no laughter. Only the sound of quills scratching as Marco tried to commit every memory to parchment, as if fearing the world he had seen might vanish, if not written down. The trial of truth came not in the council chamber, but on the battlefield. War erupted between Venice and Genoa, and Marco, whether by choice or coercion, took command of a galley. The sea was no stranger to him, but the Adriatic was not the Pacific. Here, every ship on the horizon might carry a flag of death. In the chaos of the Battle of Curzola, Marco's galley was rammed, boarded, and taken. The man who had walked the courts of emperors now found himself shackled in a Genoese prison. Yet it was here, in the dim light of a cell, that his greatest legacy began. His cellmate, Rusticolo de Pisa, was a writer of romances, a man who could spin silk from words. Marco dictated his memories, the deserts, the palaces, the wars, and Rusticolo wove them into a tapestry of adventure and wonder. The world outside might doubt him, but on parchment, his truth became legend. Years later, when Marco finally walked free, Venice was older, grayer, less forgiving. He returned to his home, to his family, to a city that still did not know what to make of him. But the manuscript, the travels of Marco Polo, had already begun its journey beyond the city's canals, crossing borders and centuries. When death came for him in 1324, it was quiet. Friends urged him to recant, to admit his tales were exaggerated. He refused. "I have not told half of what I saw," he said, and with that, he left the world as he had lived in it, straddling the line between the known and the unimaginable. The waves outside Venice's walls still rose and fell, indifferent to the passing of men. In the east, beyond deserts and mountains, cities still bustled under skies Marco would never see again. And somewhere in those distant lands, perhaps, a traveler stood at a city gate, looking toward the horizon, dreaming of what lay beyond. The year was slipping toward its final winter. In the quiet canals of Venice, the chill of the lagoon hung heavy in the air, clinging to the stone walls like a lingering ghost. For most of the city, the Silk Road was just a rumor, a distant dream whispered in the spice markets, where cinnamon and cloves mingled with the scent of damp wood. But for Marco Polo, it was not a dream. It was a heartbeat that still thudded in his chest, even decades after he had left the courts of the East. Though the war with Genoa had ended, its scars were carved deep into the city. Venice's proud fleet was thinner, its coffers lighter, and its people wary. The Polos, once respected merchants, lived now in a strange twilight of fame and doubt. The travels of Marco Polo had begun to circulate among merchants, priests, and scholars. Some read it in awe, others laughed, dismissing it as the fantasies of a prisoner desperate to seem important. Marco, however, did not seek their approval. He knew what he had seen: the gold leaf ceilings of Kublai Khan's palace, the snow fields of the Pamir Mountains where the air was so thin it burned the lungs, the caravans that stretched across the horizon like moving cities. And somewhere in his mind's eye, the Khan himself, older now, perhaps dead, perhaps ruling still, but forever seated on that jade throne, watching the world with the eyes of a man who had conquered it. Even in the comfort of his Venetian home, Marco could not sit still. At night, he would pace the darkened halls, stopping to touch relics of his travels. A sword from the Mongol cavalry, its hilt worn smooth. A roll of silk so fine it could pass through a man's ring. A tiny porcelain horse, chipped at the ear, given to him by a boy in Yunnan who had never seen the sea. These objects were not just souvenirs. They were anchors to a life that seemed impossibly far away. One evening, a messenger arrived from the arsenal, Venice's great shipyard and naval stronghold. Pirates from the Dalmatian coast had begun harassing Venetian trade routes, and the Senate sought counsel from experienced sailors. Marco went, expecting to be dismissed as a relic of a bygone era. Instead, he found himself in a room filled with the sharp scent of tar and salt, surrounded by men young enough to be his sons. They listened as he spoke of currents, winds, and the temperaments of foreign waters. His words carried the weight of a man who had navigated not just seas, but entire continents. It was then that Marco realized something. The East was no longer just a story. It was a map in the minds of younger men who would never have dreamed of such places without his words. They asked him about the deserts, the mountains, the markets where you could buy rubies the size of a fist. And though he knew their journeys would never be exactly like his, he felt a quiet pride. The road he had traveled was echoing into the future. But the echo was not always kind. Whispers followed him through the streets, that he was a liar, that no such empire could exist, that no Christian could have served so long in the court of a pagan ruler without losing his soul. Some said he had exaggerated for fame. Others believed he had betrayed Venice's secrets to the East. Marco bore the insults with the patience of a man who had walked through sandstorms and blizzards. He had faced worse than words. In the spring of 1320, a delegation arrived from Persia. They brought letters bearing the seal of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol rulers of the Persian lands. The Khan's envoy had read the travels and sought to renew the old spirit of exchange between East and West. Though Marco was too old to travel again, the sight of those wax seals made his heart race. The Silk Road was alive. It had not ended with him. The final years of his life were quieter, but never dull. He watched as young merchants set out for Trebizond, Tabriz, and beyond, carrying goods and, unknowingly, fragments of his legacy. He would meet them in the markets, listening to their tales, sometimes smiling knowingly when they described a city he had once walked. Often, they would ask him if the stories were true, and always he would give the same answer: "I have not told the half of what I saw." When the end came in 1324, Venice was in mourning. Not officially, for the Senate still debated whether Marco Polo was a hero or a fraud, but in the hearts of those who had believed in him. In the arsenal, shipbuilders paused their work to speak of the man who had mapped the East in words. In the spice markets, merchants touched the silks he had brought and thought of lands far beyond the lagoon. He was buried quietly, without the grandeur of a state funeral, but his grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Sailors, merchants, and dreamers left tokens there. A coin from the Levant, a scrap of parchment with foreign script, a feather from an unknown bird. The Silk Road might have been far away, but in that corner of Venice, its echo lingered. Centuries later, when new empires rose and fell, when oceans replaced caravans as the highways of trade, Marco Polo's name endured. Not because everyone believed every word, but because he had dared to tell them. His journeys were not just about geography, but about the boundless hunger of the human spirit to see beyond the horizon. And in the quiet, if you stood long enough at his grave and listened past the lapping of the lagoon's waters, you might still hear it. The distant sound of caravan bells, ringing faintly from a road that has no end. Venice, decades after Marco Polo's journeys, was a city in constant argument with itself. Its marble palaces glittered in the Adriatic sun, but its streets whispered like the wind in an old ship's sails. And among those whispers, one name returned again and again: Marco Polo. By now, the travels of Marco Polo had been copied, translated, and passed from hand to hand across Europe. In the camelot rooms of monasteries, monks bent over parchment, carefully tracing his words, their minds filling with visions of cities paved in gold, rivers thick with pearls, and emperors whose power stretched beyond imagination. Yet for every reader enchanted by the tale, another scoffed, shaking his head. "How can one man see so much?" they asked. "How can a merchant's son from Venice stand in the presence of the great Khan and live to tell of it?" The age was not kind to dreamers. The church, powerful and suspicious, often looked upon tales of the East with an unblinking eye. Priests feared that too much fascination with foreign lands and foreign rulers might lead Christians astray. Some clerics condemned Marco's work outright, claiming it was a dangerous blend of truth and heathen wonder. But there was something deeper than religious fear: politics. Venice was locked in rivalries not only with Genoa, but with other rising powers of trade: Pisa, Florence, and the maritime kingdoms of the East. If Marco's tales inspired other merchants to seek new routes, the city's monopoly on wealth and knowledge could be threatened. It was safer for some powerful men to call him a liar than to risk his vision becoming a map for competitors. Yet, in private, those same men pored over his descriptions, marking the locations of ports, estimating the value of goods, and dreaming of how to reach them. Hypocrisy was as common in the palaces of Venice as the scent of salt water. The doubt became part of his legend. In the markets, street storytellers, the cantastorie, would recite tales of Marco Polo to gathered crowds, their hands drawing in the air the shape of mountains and palaces, their voices dropping to a whisper when speaking of deserts so vast they swallowed armies. But just as the crowd leaned in, they would pause, smile, and say, "Or so he claimed." The listeners would laugh, shake their heads, but still come back the next day for more. What kept the legend alive was not proof, but possibility. Even those who doubted could not help but wonder, what if it was true? In foreign courts, his name carried more weight than in his own city. In Persia, traders swore by his accounts of the Mongol postal system. In Constantinople, Byzantine merchants sought routes he had described. And in the courts of emerging powers like Portugal and Castile, his writings stirred the ambitions of a new generation, sailors and navigators who began to dream not of caravans, but of ships strong enough to cross oceans. But in Venice, the man himself was fading. He was no longer the golden-eyed youth who had set out for the East. He was a man weathered by time and the skepticism of his peers. Yet when asked on his deathbed to recant his tales, Marco gave his most famous reply: "I have not told the half of what I saw." It was a statement that both fueled belief and deepened doubt. For some, it was proof that his adventures had been even greater than he dared to write. For others, it was the last flourish of a storyteller unwilling to break character. Years after his death, when explorers like Christopher Columbus prepared their voyages, they carried with them worn copies of the travels. To them, Marco Polo was not a liar. He was a compass pointing toward a wider world. And so the man became the myth, and the myth became the map. Truth and imagination tangled together like threads in a Venetian tapestry, so that even now, centuries later, it is impossible to separate them. Perhaps that is the final, most enduring truth of Marco Polo's life, that the greatest journeys are not just measured in miles or months, but in the dreams they leave behind, dreams so powerful they survive wars, oceans, and even doubt itself. The night over Venice was still. The lagoon mirrored the faint silver of the moon, broken only by the slow movement of a gondola gliding through the narrow canals. Somewhere, a bell tolled softly, not to mark the hour, but to mark the passing of a man whose journeys had reshaped the way the West imagined the East. Marco Polo had left this world, yet his absence felt like a door left ajar, as though the man had simply stepped into another part of the map, one we could not follow. In the days after his passing, the Polo household was visited by an odd mixture of mourners, merchants, and skeptics. Some came to pay their respects. Others came to see if, perhaps, the old man had left behind hidden maps or secret letters. In a wooden chest, they found fragments of notes, sketches of cities, rough outlines of coastlines, curious symbols in the margins. But none of it was complete. It was as if Marco had been writing a book that was never meant to end. That was the truth of his life. He had never truly finished his journey. For though his feet had returned to Venice, his mind had never stopped wandering. Even in his last years, sitting by the window of his home, he would look out at the ships entering the lagoon and trace their routes in his head, imagining the winds they would chase, the ports they would find, the people they would meet. And sometimes, late at night, he would speak softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the memory of the road itself. He would recall the sound of a caravan waking in the desert before dawn, the glow of lanterns swinging from saddles, the way the air turned cold just before sunrise. He would remember the laughter of Persian merchants in a smoky tea house, the solemn gaze of a Mongol horseman guarding a pass in the mountains, the endless silence of the Gobi stretching to the horizon. What he carried back to Venice was more than goods or gold. It was a vision of the world, vast, layered, interconnected. A vision that clashed with the narrow maps of Europe, maps that showed the East as little more than a margin beyond Jerusalem. And yet, the Europe of Marco's time was not ready to walk the roads he had seen. It would take centuries for ships to sail those seas, for merchants to build those trade routes, for cultures to meet in ways more lasting than war. But his words traveled faster than caravans. They slipped into the hands of sailors, scholars, dreamers. They sparked questions in the minds of kings and inspired navigators to push beyond the horizon. Some of those navigators would live and die chasing cities they never found. Others would stumble upon lands Marco had never imagined. But all of them, knowingly or not, walked the unfinished road he had left behind. And maybe that is the real legacy of a traveler. Not to chart every mile, but to make others believe that there is always another mile worth walking. The gondola on the canal passed beneath a low bridge. The water rippled, distorting the moon's reflection into silver shards. Somewhere beyond the edge of sight, beyond the familiar, another road waited. And if you listen closely to the night air, you could almost hear a voice, the voice of a Venetian merchant, son of a man who dared to cross the world, whispering, as he always had, "I have not told the half of what I saw." Centuries rolled on, and the Venice Marco Polo had known changed beyond recognition. The timber docks that had once welcomed silk-laden ships from the east now welcomed cannons and war galleys. The merchants' songs faded under the heavy clink of chains as the Republic fought to hold onto its slipping power. Yet, through all the shifting tides of history, one name kept resurfacing, whispered in marketplaces, printed in books, carried across oceans in the minds of explorers. Marco Polo. The manuscript of Il Milione, often called the Travels of Marco Polo, spread like wildfire, though not always in its original form. It was copied, translated, exaggerated, and sometimes outright doubted. Some scribes polished it into polished Latin, others added illustrations that made Cathay's palaces glitter with gold leaf. But no matter the version, the core story, the Venetian who had crossed the roof of the world to stand in the court of the great Khan, remained. In the age of maps, his name became a compass point. Christopher Columbus himself carried a worn copy of Polo's book on his voyages, its margins filled with notes and calculations, as if Cathay lay just beyond the horizon. To him, Polo's words were not fantasy, they were coordinates for a new world. Merchants in Lisbon pored over Polo's descriptions of ports and markets, using them as blueprints for trade routes. Scholars in Paris debated whether his accounts of paper money, coal, and the postal system were real or elaborate inventions. Even those who doubted him could not ignore him, because doubt, too, was a form of fascination. And in the East, his name endured in more subtle ways. In the dusty archives of Beijing, in old records of Yuan diplomacy, there were traces, references to a foreigner from the far west who had served in the Khan's court. No long speeches, no detailed biographies, just a shadow passing through history's pages. The 17th and 18th centuries brought the age of empires, and Polo's image shifted again. Now he was held up as a symbol of daring exploration, the proof that the unknown could be known, that the farthest lands could be reached. Painters depicted him in silks and furs, standing before a map of the world with one hand outstretched toward the east. By the 19th century, steamships and railways had conquered distances that once took Polo years to cross. Yet, in an age where travel was becoming faster and more mechanical, his journeys felt even more romantic. Writers turned him into a character, part historian, part myth. The line between the man and the legend blurred until they were inseparable. And then came the modern world, planes tracing his caravan routes in hours, satellites mapping the passes he had crossed on horseback. Historians armed with archaeology and linguistics began retracing his path, verifying details he had recorded centuries earlier. Some discoveries vindicated him, others deepened the mystery. But through it all, the echoes of Marco Polo's voice persisted. Not in the clatter of hooves on the Silk Road, but in the curiosity of every traveler who looked at a distant horizon and felt the pull to cross it. Because Polo had never been just a man who traveled. He had been a bridge between worlds, between centuries, between what was and what could be. And bridges, once built, keep carrying people long after their builders are gone. In the grand library of human history, Marco Polo's chapter may be bound in parchment and ink, but its story is still being written, each time someone, somewhere, takes a step into the unknown. The sun set slowly beyond the Venetian lagoon, casting a golden glow over the labyrinth of canals and marble palaces. The city, forever entwined with water and light, seemed to hold its breath, as if listening for a story still unfolding, centuries after the last footsteps of its most famous son had faded into history. Marco Polo's journey was not just across continents, but across time itself. His life had become a thread woven into the vast tapestry of human adventure, curiosity, and the eternal search for meaning beyond borders. In the quiet moments between day and night, when the world pauses and listens, you can almost hear his voice, a whisper carried by the wind through the narrow alleys and over the shimmering waters. I have not told the half of what I saw. These words are more than a claim. They are a challenge, a call to all who dream, who dare to look beyond the horizon and step into the unknown. For Marco, the journey never truly ended. It lives on in every traveler's heart, in every map drawn, in every story told beneath a foreign sky. His legacy is not in the pages of a single book, nor in the monuments that may rise and fall. It is in the restless spirit that propels humanity forward, the hunger to explore, to understand, and to connect. Venice itself is a living monument to that spirit, its canals a metaphor for the pathways that link worlds and eras. And though Marco Polo has long since returned to the dust from which he came, his footsteps echo eternally in the currents of history. As the stars begin to pierce the twilight, one might imagine the caravan bells ringing faintly across the deserts, the sails catching the first winds of dawn on distant seas, and a lone traveler setting out once more, chasing the horizon, following the unfinished road, fueled by the same unquenchable fire that burned in Marco's eyes all those centuries ago. And so, the story continues. As the echoes of Marco Polo's footsteps fade into the mist of history, one truth remains clear. The world is vast, full of stories waiting to be told, and horizons waiting to be chased. His journeys remind us that beyond every map lies a story of courage, curiosity, and the relentless pursuit of the unknown. So, whether you are a traveler of lands or a traveler of dreams, remember, every great adventure begins with a single step into the unknown. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through time. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that brings history to life. Until next time, keep exploring, keep dreaming, and keep the spirit of discovery alive.